The chandeliers of the grand concert hall glowed warmly over rows of velvet seats. It wasn't a rock concert crowd tonight. It was different. Critics, composers, orchestra members, donors in formal suits and evening gowns. The kind of place where every cough echoed and every note mattered. Near the back of the hall, sitting quietly beside a small group of guests, was Ozzy Osbourne. No flashy stage lights, no roaring guitars, just a simple black coat, round glasses, and folded hands resting on his lap. Most people didn't even notice him at first. On stage, a world-famous classical pianist was performing a powerful, technical piece. His fingers moved across the grand piano with breathtaking speed, drawing long applause from the audience. He stood, bowed proudly, and soaked in the admiration. Then his eyes wandered across the room. They stopped. He leaned toward the microphone with a playful grin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we have many kinds of musicians with us tonight, even rock stars." Some people chuckled. He continued, his voice light but teasing. "I hear Ozzy Osbourne is here." Now heads turned all around the hall. Whispers spread from seat to seat. "Is he really here?" A spotlight operator searched the audience. After a moment, the beam landed gently on Ozzy, who blinked in surprise and raised a small, awkward wave. The audience clapped politely. The pianist smiled wider. "Well, Ozzy," he said, tapping the piano lid softly, "you've spent your life on stage. Why not come up and try a real instrument for once?" A ripple of laughter moved through the hall. Some laughed loudly. Some looked uncomfortable. Ozzy didn't laugh. For a moment, he just sat there, calm, expression unreadable. He looked toward his family, then back at the stage. The pianist gestured again, inviting him forward as the crowd watched closely. Ozzy slowly stood up. Not annoyed, not embarrassed, just thoughtful. And as he began walking down the aisle toward the stage, the laughter gradually faded into a quiet murmur. No one in that hall realized the next few minutes were about to become the most unforgettable performance of the entire night. The soft echo of Ozzy's footsteps filled the aisle as he made his way toward the stage. At first, the audience clapped politely, the kind of applause reserved for novelty moments. A rock legend stepping into a classical spotlight. It felt entertaining, harmless, but the pianist wasn't finished. He adjusted his cufflinks and leaned casually against the glossy black grand piano. "You see," he said into the microphone, smiling confidently, "classical music requires discipline, years of study, precision. It's not exactly shouting into a microphone while bats fly around." The room erupted in louder laughter. A few guests exchanged amused glances. Others shifted awkwardly in their seats. Ozzy continued walking. He didn't rush. He didn't look angry. His face remained calm, almost curious, as if he were studying the moment rather than reacting to it. The pianist continued, "Of course," he added, raising his hands theatrically. "I'm sure Mr. Osbourne can manage a few keys. Perhaps we'll keep it simple. No heavy metal tonight." More laughter. Some of it genuine, some of it nervous. In the third row, a woman whispered to her husband, "This feels unnecessary." He nodded slightly but said nothing. Ozzy reached the steps of the stage. For a brief second he paused. The spotlight followed him, casting a long shadow behind him across the polished floor. The grandeur of the hall felt heavier now, the air tighter. The pianist stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy, gesturing toward the piano bench like a game show host presenting a prize. "Be my guest." A few audience members raised their phones, not because they expected brilliance, but because they expected embarrassment. That's what made it funny, or so they thought. Ozzy climbed the steps slowly and stood beside the piano. Up close, the instrument looked massive under the stage lights. Its lid reflected the chandelier's glow, making the keys gleam almost blindingly white. The pianist lowered his voice and spoke just loud enough for the front rows to hear. "Don't worry," he murmured with a smirk, "it's tuned." A couple of nearby guests laughed again. Ozzy turned his head slightly toward him. His expression didn't change. There was no flash of anger, no defensive posture, no witty comeback, just silence. He placed one hand lightly on the edge of the piano, feeling its surface. The crowd buzzed with anticipation. Was he going to joke back? Was he going to decline politely? Was this about to become awkward? From the balcony, someone called out, "Play something, Ozzy." The comment triggered scattered applause. The pianist moved toward the microphone again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said grandly, "let's see if rock royalty can survive a classical throne." The phrase drew another wave of laughter. But as Ozzy finally lowered himself onto the piano bench, something shifted. The laughter didn't disappear, but it softened. Curiosity began replacing mockery. Because despite the teasing, despite the setting, despite the expectations, Ozzy didn't look like a man walking into humiliation. He looked like a man remembering something. He adjusted the bench slightly, rolled his shoulders once, then rested his fingers gently above the keys. And for the first time that night, the room began to grow quiet.
Ozzy, let's see who plays better. You're on. Let's do it. All right, watch this.
The concert hall fell into a fragile hush. Ozzy sat motionless at the piano bench, his hands hovering just above the keys. The bright stage lights reflected off the polished surface, but he didn't seem distracted by them. His eyes weren't on the audience, they were on the keyboard, focused and distant, as if he were somewhere else entirely. In the front rows, a few guests leaned forward, expecting hesitation, maybe even a nervous laugh followed by a polite surrender. After all, this was a classical stage, a place built on perfection and training. Ozzy took a slow breath. He flexed his fingers once. The pianist stood a few feet away, arms folded, watching closely. His expression carried a hint of curiosity now, but the confidence hadn't left his face. He still expected a short, clumsy attempt, something the audience would chuckle about before the evening moved on. A man in the balcony whispered to his friend, "He probably doesn't even know where middle C is." A couple nearby smiled. Someone lifted a phone, ready to record what they assumed would be an awkward moment. Ozzy gently placed his hands onto the keys. But he didn't play. 5 seconds passed, then 10. The silence stretched across the hall like a held breath. Even the air conditioning hum felt louder than before. The audience, which had come prepared for amusement, now felt a flicker of tension. Waiting has a way of changing expectations. Ozzy closed his eyes, not tightly, just enough to shut out the room. For a brief moment, the grand concert hall seemed to disappear for him. The suits, the chandeliers, the whispers, the judgment, all gone. The only thing left was the instrument in front of him. He pressed a single key. A soft note echoed into the hall. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was controlled. A few people straightened in their seats. Ozzy let the sound fade completely before touching another key. Then another. Each note was deliberate, spaced carefully apart, as if he were testing the room, or perhaps letting the room adjust to him. The pianist's smile faded slightly. This wasn't random tapping. This was measured. Ozzy's shoulders relaxed. His breathing slowed, and his hands began to move with more certainty. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't showing off technique. He was feeling his way forward confidently, patiently. The notes began forming a pattern, soft, melancholic, almost haunting. The earlier laughter was gone now. No one whispered. No one shifted in their seat. Even the people holding phones lowered them slightly, unsure if they were interrupting something personal. Ozzy still hadn't opened his eyes. He leaned forward just a little, and his fingers flowed across a short progression. Not complex in a classical sense, but expressive, honest, the kind of sound that didn't ask for attention but quietly captured it. In the second row, a woman's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "That's actually beautiful," she murmured. The pianist uncrossed his arms. For the first time, he wasn't watching to judge. He was listening. Ozzy played another phrase, this one slightly stronger. The notes carried emotion more than technical precision. It sounded less like a performance and more like a memory unfolding. The room had completely changed. Moments earlier, the audience expected embarrassment. Now they were witnessing confidence. not the loud confidence of a rock stage, the quiet confidence of someone who wasn't trying to prove anything. Ozzy finally opened his eyes. He didn't look at the pianist. He didn't look at the audience. He looked only at the keys as his fingers settled into position again. And just before the melody truly began, you could feel it. The entire hall was listening. For a heartbeat, the hall remained suspended in silence. Ozzy's fingers hovered, then gently descended onto the keys again. This time not searching, not testing. Beginning, a low chord rolled out first, deep, resonant. It vibrated softly through the polished wood of the stage and into the velvet-lined walls. The sound wasn't aggressive, but it carried weight, like the opening line of a story you didn't realize you needed to hear. He followed with a slow, deliberate melody in the higher register. 3 notes, pause, 2 notes, pause. Each one allowed to breathe. The pacing was unexpected, not rushed, not showy. There was no attempt to impress with speed or technical fireworks. Instead, the melody unfolded carefully, like someone turning pages of an old journal. The audience leaned forward almost in unison. The pianist, who had once worn a playful smirk, now stood completely still. His head tilted slightly, listening not for mistakes, but for intention. Ozzy's left hand settled into a steady progression, anchoring the piece with a simple, grounded rhythm. His right hand began tracing something more expressive, something emotional. The melody grew. It carried a faint melancholy, but also warmth. A reflective tone that felt deeply personal. It didn't sound like classical competition. It sounded like memory. In the balcony, someone whispered, "That's not random." It wasn't. The structure began to take shape, a quiet build, subtle but deliberate. The notes flowed more confidently now, connecting into phrases instead of fragments. Ozzy's posture straightened slightly, his shoulders loosening as the music guided him forward. You could see it in his expression. He wasn't thinking about the crowd anymore. He wasn't thinking about the challenge. He was inside the music. A soft variation entered the melody, something familiar yet transformed. It felt almost like a reimagined echo of his own style, stripped of distortion and drums, translated into something intimate and vulnerable. A few audience members began recognizing it. Their eyes widened. It wasn't a classical piece at all. It was a reinterpretation, a gentle, piano-driven evolution of one of his own legendary songs, but slowed down, softened, made reflective. Instead of roaring guitars, there were trembling high notes. Instead of stage lights and smoke, there was silence and focus. The emotional weight of the piece deepened. Ozzy added a slightly stronger chord progression, allowing the melody to swell. The sound filled the hall now, not overpowering, but undeniable. Even the acoustics seemed to favor him, carrying each note clearly to the farthest corners of the room. No one laughed, no one shifted. Some held their breath without realizing it. The pianist's expression had fully changed. The confidence in his stance gave way to stillness and perhaps quiet respect. He wasn't watching a novelty moment anymore. He was witnessing musicianship. Ozzy's fingers moved with more assurance, the melody climbing gently before resolving into a tender refrain. His dynamics were controlled, soft where emotion required vulnerability, slightly stronger where feeling demanded emphasis. He wasn't trying to compete with classical technique. He wasn't trying to prove mastery. He was telling a story in the only language that mattered in that room, music. As the final progression approached, Ozzy slowed the tempo, letting the last sequence breathe. His right hand lingered on a high note while the left settled into a steady closing chord. Then silence, the final note hung in the air, shimmering before fading into nothing. Ozzy lifted his hands from the keys slowly. He didn't look up immediately. The hall remained frozen for 1 long second, 2, 3, and in that suspended moment, before applause could even begin, everyone understood. This wasn't a joke anymore. For a moment, the silence felt almost louder than the music had been. Ozzy's hands rested gently in his lap as the final note dissolved into the vast space of the concert hall. No one moved, no one spoke, The chandeliers shimmered faintly overhead, and the polished lid of the piano reflected the stunned faces in the front rows. Then a single clap sounded, sharp, clear. It came from somewhere in the balcony. Another followed, then another. Within seconds, applause spread across the hall like a wave breaking against the shore. The sound grew quickly, polite at first, then powerful, then overwhelming. People rose to their feet without realizing they were standing. Some were smiling in disbelief, others shaking their heads as if trying to process what they had just witnessed. This wasn't courtesy applause anymore. This was respect. Several audience members lifted their phones again, but this time not to capture embarrassment. They wanted proof of what had just happened. A moment that only minutes earlier no one expected to matter had suddenly become unforgettable. Ozzy remained seated for a second longer, almost surprised by the reaction. He glanced lightly at the keys, then stood slowly from the bench. He gave a small nod toward the audience, not dramatic, not theatrical, just quiet acknowledgement. The applause intensified. Near the front row, a young music student wiped her eyes. She hadn't planned to feel emotional tonight. This was supposed to be a formal recital, not something personal. Yet somehow the simplicity of the melody had reached people more deeply than the evening's flawless technical performances. Across the stage, the pianist hadn't moved. He stood where he had stepped aside earlier, staring at the piano. The confident posture he carried before was gone. His arms, once folded in certainty, now hung loosely at his sides. He wasn't embarrassed, he was humbled. Slowly, he walked toward Ozzy. The applause softened as the audience sensed another moment unfolding. He approached carefully, as though interrupting something important. For a brief second, he looked at the piano keys, then at Ozzy. Up close, his expression was no longer playful. It was sincere. He extended his hand. Ozzy looked at it, then shook it gently. The hall went quiet again. The pianist leaned toward the microphone. When he spoke, his voice carried a different tone than before, no humor, no sarcasm. I invited him on stage expecting a laugh, he admitted. He paused, glancing toward Ozzy. I was wrong. A soft murmur passed through the crowd. He continued, Tonight I was reminded that music doesn't belong to one tradition, one school, or one genre. Sometimes feeling reaches places technique cannot. The audience responded with warm applause, softer but deeper. Ozzy shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the attention. He raised a hand modestly as if to wave it off. He finally spoke into the microphone, his voice calm. I wasn't trying to prove anything, he said simply. I just played what I felt. That was all, no speech, no grand statement, and somehow that simplicity carried more weight than any performance could. The crowd stood again. This time, the applause wasn't for surprise. It was for understanding. In the space of a few minutes, the room had completely changed. What began as a joke had become a lesson, not about classical music or rock music, but about respect. And everyone there knew they had just witnessed a moment no one would forget. The applause refused to fade. Even after the pianist stepped back from the microphone, people remained standing. Some clapped slowly, thoughtfully. Others cheered openly now, no longer worried about the formality of the setting. The grand concert hall, once restrained and reserved, felt warmer, almost human. Ozzy shifted awkwardly under the spotlight. He clearly wasn't comfortable being the center of attention in this kind of environment. Rock stages, roaring crowds, blinding lights, those were familiar. But this was different. This was quiet admiration, and somehow it felt heavier. He gave another small nod to the audience and stepped slightly away from the piano, as if trying to return the focus to the evening's real performers. But the moment wasn't finished. The pianist approached him again, this time without the microphone. He spoke softly, but in the hushed hall his words still carried. I owe you an apology. Ozzy shook his head gently. You don't? The pianist looked at him, sincere. I judged you before hearing you. Ozzy gave a faint smile. Happens more than you'd think. There was no bitterness in his voice, only honesty. The pianist glanced at the instrument between them. You didn't play to impress anyone, did you? Ozzy looked down at the keys, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the piano lid. No, he said quietly. I played because music was there. For a moment neither man spoke. The audience watched, sensing this conversation mattered more than the performance itself. A member of the orchestra, an older violinist seated near the front, began clapping again, slowly, respectfully. Others followed, but this applause felt different. Not loud, not explosive. It was appreciation shared between musicians, regardless of style. The pianist turned back toward the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, voice steady, tonight we witness something rare. Not perfection, but sincerity. He gestured toward Ozzy. Technique can be practiced for decades, but honesty in music, that cannot be taught. The crowd responded warmly. Ozzy looked almost embarrassed now. He rubbed the back of his neck and gave a modest half-wave. He wasn't soaking in the praise, he was trying to escape it. He stepped toward the microphone one last time. I think sometimes we forget. He said, music isn't competition, it's connection. He paused briefly, looking out across the hall. It doesn't matter where it comes from, piano, guitar, orchestra, or a garage band. If it makes someone feel something, it matters. Silence followed his words, not empty silence, but thoughtful silence. Then a final round of applause rose, steady and genuine. Ozzy nodded once more and stepped away from the piano. This time, the pianist didn't return to center stage immediately. Instead, he lightly closed the piano lid almost ceremonially, as if acknowledging the instrument had just been part of something special. Ozzy walked toward the stairs at the side of the stage. No spotlight chased him now. No announcement followed. Yet as he exited, people instinctively parted to give him space. Some smiled at him as he passed. Others simply watched with quiet admiration. He hadn't demanded respect. He hadn't defended himself. He hadn't tried to win. And somehow, by doing none of those things, he had earned all of it. By the time the evening ended, the concert hall had returned to its usual elegance, but the atmosphere was different. People didn't rush to the exits the way they normally would after a formal event. Instead, they gathered in small circles, talking quietly, replaying the moment again and again. Did you record it? I can't believe that just happened. That melody, I felt that. Several audience members were already looking down at their phones. Clips had been uploaded before the last guests even left their seats. Short recordings captured the laughter, the walk to the stage, the first hesitant note, and finally the silence that followed the performance. Within an hour, the video began spreading online. At first, it circulated among music communities, pianists, teachers, students sharing the clip with captions full of surprise. Then it reached fan pages, then news accounts, then everywhere. Millions watched. What fascinated people wasn't just that Ozzy played piano. It was how he handled the moment. Viewers noticed he never argued. He never snapped back at the joke. He never used his fame to defend himself. He simply responded with music. Comments poured in beneath the videos. True confidence is quiet. He didn't embarrass the pianist. He elevated the room. That's what humility looks like. Musicians from different genres began sharing the clip too. Guitarists, vocalists, even classical performers posted reactions, praising the sincerity of performance. Many pointed out that while technique impresses, emotion connects. The story stopped being about one night at a concert. It became a lesson. Talk shows mentioned it. Radio hosts discussed it. Music teachers played it for students as an example of expression over ego. The pianist himself later posted a short message online, thanking Ozzy for accepting the invitation and admitting he had learned something important about respect between artists. His words were simple but genuine. Meanwhile, Ozzy never posted about it personally. No long explanation. No self-congratulation. When asked about the incident in a brief interview days later, he shrugged slightly and said, I just played a song. People made it bigger than it was. But that was exactly why it mattered, because in a world where arguments go viral and pride grows loud, a quiet response had reached millions, not by confrontation, but by dignity. The video continued spreading across countries and languages. Viewers who didn't even follow rock or classical music still understood the message. Never assume someone's limits, never judge talent by appearance, and never underestimate humility. Long after the night ended, the story lived on, not as a controversy, not as a rivalry, but as a reminder. Sometimes the strongest answer isn't a comeback. Sometimes it's a single note played at the right moment. If you believe respect matters more than ego, write respect in the comments and subscribe for more powerful stories.